My name is Hannah Jo, and I'm happy to be seated here tonight with Dr. Allie. And she is a woman who shares an interest with me in sexuality and drugs. Yeah. And so I'm very excited to delve deeper into our shared passions tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm excited. It's so nice to meet everyone. I'm going to go through a very brief slide deck just to kind of give you all an overview of the work that I do. And then I would love to have more of a conversation with you all. But please know that this is very short because I would like to hear from you all too. So just to give you all a little bit of information about me, I am a sex educator by trade, and I also very recently started intimacy coordination, which if you've heard of this new job on movie sets, it's basically any kind of intimate scene, which can really mean anything. So when I started intimacy coordination, I was kind of thinking like, oh, it'll be like a sex scene, it'll be a kiss. My first paid gig, I had to waterboard someone. So, so like really anything can be intimate in the eyes of a director or a writer. So that was me waterboarding the director in front of the actor who was actually going to get waterboarded in the blue shirt back there. And it went well, he didn't die. So we're very happy about that. But so I went to grad school to become an educator, and then very quickly really found a passion for teaching what we call human development in independent schools. So I specialized in kindergarten through 12th grade human development education in Los Angeles. And I mainly teach in independent schools because they basically allow me to do and teach how I know is best for youth based on the work that I did in my dissertation. But so I've spent a lot of time going around to different organizations, schools, and then also universities and other institutes of learning to show them how I teach what I teach. So just like going from the left, that was me at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland, showing how I taught a middle school curriculum. My favorite grades to teach are middle school because they're just feral young creatures. And then I also loved putting together a very specific curriculum for grades 11 and 12, so juniors and seniors in high school, going all over birth control, emergency contraceptives, and STIs, which was a 2-hour workshop. And then most recently, I've actually helped start the workshop series at Sunday Fair, which is a nonprofit for sex worker wellness in Los Angeles. So teaching sex workers about sexual wellness, understanding or giving them an understanding of their own bodies and also what resources they have access to in Los Angeles has been something that I've spent my summer doing this summer. And just a little bit about me. But I wanted to show you all this model that I used kind of to create curriculum. So this is the Circles of Sexuality model founded by Dr. Dennis Daly at my alma mater, the University of Kansas. And this kind of goes over all of the circles that include sex ed. When we talk about sex ed in 2024, most people think like the condom on banana model. And that's really just that one blue circle. So that's the sexual health and reproduction circle, is how our bodies change and how we got here on this planet, is how I explain it to students. But with comprehensive sex ed, we go into all the other colors and all the other circles. So we have our gender and sexual identity, which is who we are and who we like. I talk a lot about intimacy with students, so the relationships that we have with other people. And I explain this to them, like we have relationships with everyone in our lives. That could be the Starbucks barista that you talk to every morning. It could be your best friend, it could be your parents. So explaining kind of what kinds of relationships we have and how to make sure that they're healthy ones. And then sensuality as well, which is how we feel about ourselves and our bodies. And then sexualization is the red circle. This one is always the hardest to talk about and the ones that schools are kind of most afraid of, but personally I think it's the most important, which is how sex can influence and then harm people. And then in the center of all of those circles are our values. So when I go to a new school, I really emphasize the values of a school and say, these are the values that you preach to your students and their families. When we talk about these 5 different parts of comprehensive sexuality education, really lean on your school values if parents, caregivers, or students have any issues with anything that we talk about, because values should be at the center of everything, and they really give us the lens of how we process information. So I wanted to show you all, this was the first iteration of my comprehensive sex ed curriculum. And this was for middle school and high school. So I kind of went through all the circles to create my lessons and kind of delve into these different topics. So this was over the course of a full school year for grades 6 through 12. And we started, I gave a really very basic introduction to what comprehensive sex ed was, kind of like what I just gave you all going through the circles. And then I did a whole lesson on what are your values, and having students from grade 6, so about age 12, all the way up till our 18-year-old students really identifying what their personal values were before we even got into any curricular activities or diving into any of these topics. Then we went into sexual health and reproduction, which was all about your body and how it works. We talked about contraceptives and STIs. We did a lot on puberty, especially in middle school, so kids understood what they were going through. Pregnancy and parenting. I love this one because it was really sneaky for me to get the abortion talk in there, because when parents saw pregnancy and parenting, they thought, oh, okay, great. And then sneaky me going, okay, what if you don't want to parent? What if you get pregnant, you don't want to parent? How does that work? So really kind of trying to be very cautious with how I word and title all of my different lessons. And then types of sexual behavior, making sure students understand what sex is. So going into oral, anal, and vaginal sex, and then also discussing what's called outer course has been something that I've started doing with more students. Outer course is anything that is not penetrative, that a lot of people have started to recognize in the sex ed community. With identity, we talked about sex versus gender roles and stereotypes, sexual orientation, and then how to be an ally, how to be a friend to people in the LGBT plus community. With intimacy, I talked a lot about sexual decision making, so like how to make sure that you know kind of what you're doing and within that relationship with yourself as well as with other people. What are healthy relationships? And then we also did a whole lesson on how to have in-person communication, especially coming off of a global pandemic. Kids have forgotten how to communicate in person. I think adults have too, but I have access to our youth. And then with sensuality, we did a lot on body image and self-esteem. And then we also talked a lot about stress and anxiety, which are things that plague a lot of students today. And then last but not least, with sexualization, we did a lot of consent education. We looked at advertising and media messages, and then we also talked about bullies and bystanders. The biggest issues we get at every single school every year is bullying. And a lot of times, kids don't even know what that means. So really talking about what it means to be a bully, what it means to be a bystander, has been a really important part of the curriculum too. So I just wanted to share these resources with you all because I love sharing these with my caregivers that I work with. So the first one on the top left is amaze.org. They're really beautifully curated cartoons that go over a bunch of amazing topics. And it's for young people, caregivers, educators, and then also healthcare providers. And they're like super short form cartoons that explain a lot of things. And they're also really funny. So kids really like these. SECUS is the Sexual Information and Education Council of the United States. They update all of us on what needs to be taught, kind of mandated statewide, and then also across the country. California is one of only 13 states that requires medically accurate sex ed. I'm very happy to live here and be able to teach what I teach. Because some states actually require you to lie to students. We are not one of them, thank God. Advocates for Youth is a nonprofit legal advocacy group that helps students actually be the ones to transform policies, programs, and systems. So it's really giving the youth the power to make the changes. PFLAG is also an institution that I love plugging to our caregivers because it's the parents, families, and friends of lesbians and gays. They have chapters in every major city in America, and it's just basically a great place to network with other parents, friends, and family of LGBT plus youth. And then the Gutmaker Institute is a great non-government org. They have a what's it called? An interactive abortion map that I constantly am updating my slides with because every 2 weeks they have a different version of their map where you can see what kind of policies are being passed or being like pushed to the different governmental organizations. And it's a really, really beautifully laid out map. You can click on all the states, cities, and figure out what's going on legislatively. And then I'm sure you all have heard of Planned Parenthood, but I really do try to push students onto kind of what they do, because there's so much that Planned Parenthood is able to provide our youth. And in the state of California, you can actually be 13 and not have any parental consent to go in and get services. So if students have the need for condoms, they can go in there and they don't need parental consent. Or they can even get access to birth control, even if their parents don't want them to. And then soon, they're still working on this, but gender affirming care will also be under that umbrella of things that students don't have to tell their parents about necessarily. So very late in the game, so this was 2 years into my educational journey, I decided it was a really good idea to add substance education into my curriculum because, I mean, sex and drugs, we all think, like, of course they go hand in hand. But when teaching youth, I was realizing that so many students were admitting to taking drugs, both legally, a lot of them are taking tons of different prescription medications that doctors are prescribing for them. But then also, when they go out and socialize, they're exposed to so many different drugs. And it's really important for me as an educator to give them just more information about what they're putting in their bodies. So part of my comprehensive sex and substance education moving forward into my third year of this kind of education was really trauma-informed and harm reduction strategies. So with trauma-informed practices, that really stemmed from working in different Catholic institutions. We have a lot of students who are really kind of told that they can only be one way or that they should wait and be abstinent until marriage. That was a legitimate sign that I saw in a school. It said, the dinosaurs had sex and look what happened to them. It's a meteor killing them. It was in an actual school that I was asked to work in. And then a project that I did with a group of students was they had to design their own place of worship based on like a place that they would feel safe and comfortable to worship in. Because religion can be beautiful. And again, that's a value that I tell students. Like, if you want to have religion as part of your life, that is a value. And then with harm reduction strategies, I did a very fun substance matching game my third year teaching, where students had to organize different substances into stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogens. I've updated this so much since then. But basically, students had to look at different substances and based on their potential and desired outcomes, put them in the right places. So students, again, having to like learn the names of different substances and then figure out based on what category, where they thought it would go. And this is a lot of really great just conversations with students. And it was wild to me. That was my face after hearing how much they knew about meth because of Breaking Bad. These kids were they knew a lot about meth. But I was really impressed by that. So this was a slide that I took from my friend Rana Hashemi, which I don't know if you all know the organization called No Drugs. So it's KNOW Drugs. She is getting her PhD at Stanford in social psychology, and she created this substance use spectrum that I use with students. Because a lot of the times when we think of using substances, we think of you're either a non-user or like you're an addict, kind of like that black and white thinking. And I love showing this to students and parents, particularly, just to give them an idea of what the spectrum is, because a lot of our students fall within 2 and 3, is what I hear and kind of remember with my own experience as a youth in Los Angeles specifically. A lot of people are not non-use or addicts, somewhere in the middle. So making sure that they know what that means was really important to me. This is something that I very recently added to my curriculum was Narcan training. So there are a lot of organizations that will offer Narcan training if you ask them. There's a lot of great organizations such as Out Here Health is my favorite in Los Angeles, where they will give you Narcan, they will train you in Narcan, and then you are able to provide that education to any community. I will say when it comes to giving out Narcan to youth under 18, it can get iffy. So a lot of the times I'll tell them, like, you can go and get it at this place. I cannot legally give it to you. But when I go onto college campuses, which I've started doing very recently, I make I call them goodie bags, and I put a bunch of different things in them. So in there, we've got the xylazine test strips, we've got the fentanyl test strips. I also put condoms, lubricant, and then I put some candy in there as well, because why not? As well as some Narcan. So students should always have 2 Narcan on them at all times too, mainly because one can malfunction, but also you sometimes will need more than 1 Narcan if someone is unconscious until the emergency services can get there. So I always tell students 2 is always your best bet when it comes to Narcan. But I put this little kit together for a festival safety training at an organization that was Greek affiliated, so fraternities and sororities. Before they went off to Coachella, I gave them all these little goodie bags. So these are some drug ed resources that I think are great for you to know. Again, the No Drugs is just an awesome nonprofit. And then the REACH Lab at Stanford is really cool if you have not heard of it. It's the Research and Education to Empower Adolescents and Young Adults to Choose Health is what REACH stands for. But they put on really great, both free and really really cheap workshops that you can take both virtually and in person that teach you a lot about different substances. The MAPS, so Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. I actually went to Psychedelic Science last summer. They paused this summer, but they're going to be back in Denver next summer. And they just have a lot of great talks about psychedelics and what amazing things they can do. Dance Safe, I actually found out about in high school at a music festival. And they're at every major music festival now handing out different kits of different, like test strips. But they also are great at just like they have everything on site for if someone gets hurt, you can go to their tent and they have medical professionals there to help anyone. And then Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I love the Australian sect of this, but they have an SSDP chapter in most major countries now, which is really nice. Highly recommend looking into them. But so kind of similar to Dance Safe, I was thinking about my own experience as a high schooler in LA. So, and I was like, okay, you know what, we should add media literacy to my curriculum in a way that's not as, what's the word I'm looking for? I think a lot of the media literacy education that we think of as high school and middle school teachers is very like, oh, kids are watching cartoons or they're watching rated R movies. And part of what I love teaching now, especially at a high school and college level, is thinking about like kind of what rock and roll has become in the 21st century and in 2024. Going to concerts, going to music festivals, having access to anything at the, just like every like little tiny smartphone has access to way more than we ever did at their age. So thinking about this was my own grade in high school. We got the days off basically to go to Coachella because so many kids would go from my high school to the music festival, and thinking about how it really influenced what we did, what we wanted to be, and then also just like the mere exposure effect too. We really were able to kind of do and see what we wanted because that was what we were exposed to at such an early age. And I will say this is very tame compared to what my students are doing now. The parties that they're going to, the things that they share. And sometimes I'm like, please don't share that. I don't want to hear it. I'm a mandated reporter. But it's really wild to me how much students have access to. And because of that, I've added the 18 plus media consumption to my educational kind of all the different lessons that I teach, especially for seniors. I do a whole class, and I'll explain it in a moment when I go through my updated curriculum. But I do a lot of education about consent. There's a new acronym called RAC, which is Risk Aware Consensual Kink. And basically what it is just making sure that if people have different kinks that they want to explore, that it's risk aware and completely consensual with whatever partner or partners. And this was important to me because there's been a lot of instances, especially in the news, where young people are having their first exposures to sex or to anything, again, outer course related, and they're not consensual and they're very violent. So this was in the UK. There was a girl who was 12. She was strangled during her first kiss because the person who was kissing her saw that in porn and thought that that was normal. So again, this is what our 18 plus media consumption is teaching, especially our younger youth watching and consuming this media before they're legally supposed to. And then also there's been a huge rise in erectile dysfunction with our youth. This is something that I hear and see a lot of, especially just working with this demographic. But a lot of people are self-medicating with Viagra because they're afraid of having erectile dysfunction around real life human people, because they cannot get an erection or maintain an erection without pornography present. And this is in teenagers. So it's really kind of scary to see, but these are all trends. So this is my updated curriculum, and just really quickly wanted to point out the amount of things that I've added to intimacy, sensuality, and sexualization, just based on knowing this population a little bit better, and thinking again about my own experience growing up in a very kind of media-heavy world. But the ones that students have really appreciated is the healthy habits is kind of where I throw in my drug education. With sensuality, I've talked a lot about skin hunger in the past few years. And skin hunger is where we just want to touch other people. And especially post-pandemic, we're seeing a lot of that with students wanting to hug, getting into more fights, because they just want to touch, which is really interesting. We've done a lot of exploration as well with neurodiversity and learning about how students' brains work. It's something that we love to talk about. And students love to talk about their diagnoses as well, something that I'm finding out. And then with sexualization, just based on conversations I've had with students, we've done a whole lesson on seduction, flirting, and sexting, because I thought that was something that was an important thing to discuss with youth. Did a whole thing about different power dynamics. The difference between sex work and sex trafficking was something that I also wanted to share, because there's been a lot of misinformation around that. Just kind of plot twist, the big difference is consent. Work is consensual, trafficking is you're doing it against your will. And then ethical erotica and pornography was a class that I offered for seniors at a school in LA, where it was basically a senior seminar. So students who were second semester seniors could choose an elective. We had 87 kids sign up for this class, and every single one of them attended every single session. So we were very happy to see that it was not only high interest, but kids were actually showing up to take it, which was amazing. And then I just wanted to quickly show you all, these are great resources that I've used around my media literacy education and curriculum creation. Common Sense Media, if you're a parent, I promise you've heard of this. They're the greatest at giving you entertainment and tech recommendations for your youth. So if you see a movie's coming out, you can Google it, and Common Sense Media will tell you, don't show your kids if, and it'll give you a whole list of trigger warnings. They're amazing. The Pornhub Wellness Center is also something that not a lot of people know about, but in 2017, Pornhub decided to start this center where it gives you a lot of information about actual healthy sexuality is what they call it. And then also they give really great advice to people who want it. And it's all experts within the sexual health field. That started in 2017. And then GLAAD. So GLAAD is an amazing organization that is, let's see, I wanted to say what it meant. Oh yeah, Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation is what it stands for. I always forget it. But it was founded in New York City to respond to the New York Post's response to the AIDS coverage, which really kind of everyone thought that AIDS was a gay disease because of how the New York Post covered it. And so now what GLAAD does a lot of the time is make sure that we all, as consumers, are way more media literate in how we consume our media. So they've got a lot of great resources on how to teach that to youth. The USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative is something that I've learned about working with student filmmakers, and they're a great think tank, and they basically do a lot of studies on the inclusion DEI within entertainment. And a lot of that is around media literacy as well. And then NAMLY is the National Association for Media Literacy Education, and they have great resources for if you want to become more media literate or help other people in your life become more media literate. But that's really all I have to share with you about what I do. But I would love to have a conversation with you all, answer any questions, or just hear from you in terms of what kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll play in your life. Because if I can help answer any questions, I would love to.
That was a great presentation, and there is space for us to tune in to the audience as well. But before going that direction, I want to hear more about you are obviously like progressive in your advocacy for talking about sexuality and drugs or substance usage. And I am also in my own way in that line of work as like an educator and facilitator and space holder for people to heal through their sexual trauma or just really expand their understanding of intimacy and sexuality. And I feel because personally there was an absence of sex education in my life, that always made it more attractive to me. Because I'm like, there's this big thing over here that no one is talking to me about, and therefore that is my entire interest. And so I wonder about your background and like connecting with your mom. I feel her positivity and she's beaming over there. So happy to see this situation. But I'm wondering like what your sex education was like in your upbringing and if it was present or absent and what really brought you to focus on that.
Oh, that's such a good question. So I've had friends ask me this all the time, but my sex ed was actually pretty limited. Like I just remember in 6th grade, we were showed a tampon and a pad. I mean, they poured the liquid on it and they're like, magic. That was my puberty talk. And then in high school, in LA, we had the Kaiser Permanente team, which is a bunch of theater majors who came in and they did a whole thing about condom use. So that was my whole sex ed. But then actually in college, I was the risk manager of my sorority, which if anyone knows, in a sorority, basically risk manager would make sure that people didn't like ruin the reputation of the sorority by doing crazy things at parties. But also I was in charge of reputation management. So if a girl got pregnant, I had to make sure that they were like asked to leave, which was really painful. But I also decided like, okay, I'm risk manager. I'm going to take on like helping girls not get pregnant. So providing them with that education that in the state of Kansas where I went to school, none of them got, like my sex ed was bad, but theirs was really bad or non-existent. But yeah, I agree. It's like, I think most people, especially people who are, I don't know, probably 20 plus have gotten just really bad sex ed, but it depends on where you live.
Yeah, totally. Well, you're the sex educator that I wish I had in my youth.
Thank you.
And I imagine some folks in the audience agree with me on that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Totally. And it
Good
feels really like refreshing to know that you are in Los Angeles, you know, bringing this wisdom to the youth. And I'm curious to hear more about the directions that you see, like, following your inspiration, because I understand you're involved with the nonprofit that supports sex workers, and you also shared with me the intimacy coordination role. So it goes beyond the independent schools. And what is your vision for the way that you want to share yourself and your knowledge?
Totally. That's another great question. I think I'm just open to any kind of opportunity to be able to help other people understand what sexuality education is and just better understand themselves too. Because I think, like you said, it's like we're constantly trying to learn more about the world. And I mean, I'm constantly learning things about myself as someone in my late 20s. Like, I think that's part of the fun of doing this work is that I'm constantly learning and then bringing it into my classroom. So like when I kind of, what's the Maya Angelou quote? Like, I know better and then I do better and then I teach better. So I think that's part of the fun of this work is, especially, I mean, being in education, there's so many teachers that I know who have had the same lesson plans for like 40 years. We've all known that teacher who's been at the school for years and is basically like a relic. But what I love about the work that I do is I spend so much time updating my lessons. I've never taught the same lesson twice. And it's because I learn, I get feedback from students, I watch something new, I read a piece of news, and then I continually update what I do. And I think that's part of the fun of getting to teach this subject, is that it's constantly evolving. And I also feel like because sexuality is such a wide range of topics, that I'm never gonna have a curriculum that stays the same. Like I feel like in even 2 or 3 years, that list of my curriculum is gonna be too big to fit on a screen. Because I'm hoping to keep adding new cool topics and things to talk about with our youth.
Yeah. I think anything around like interpersonal relationships or our relationship to our own body will always evolve. And I feel that's another misconception that people in our society have, is around their sexuality and it being fixed to sort of how they first experienced it through pleasuring themselves or their early sexual experiences. So I was just like considering how your teaching and curriculum will evolve as sexual energy and sexuality does. Like it is an energy that's in motion. And if it stagnates, then that's an invitation to get curious about what's happening.
It's so true. Especially in I call it the lesbian renaissance that we're living in now with media. I mean, all of the major people in music right now are lesbian women. When you like look at everything going around, I mean, it's amazing. It's so cool. As a lesbian woman myself, I'm like, this is amazing. And I'm thinking about what that's going to mean for our students and for youth who are consuming this media. What is that going to like look like for them? So you're right. It's like as we become more accepting as a society to artists and to just people in general of differing identities, what that's going to mean. And my biggest fear is that parents, because I've seen this a lot, is parents think, oh, it's cool to be transgender or it's cool to be gay. That's why my student is trying on this label. And I say to them, well, that's what being young is for. We try on labels, and if they don't work for us, they don't serve us, we can always move past. Like, because I will say I do have a lot of students who identify as LGBT plus at very young ages, but the vast majority of the time they do not change that label, is what I will say.
Totally.
Yeah.
I feel like it's related for our generation and for the youth, is like celebrating adaptability. And our parents and generations before us are maybe not in a flexible or malleable mindset around identification or even choice of consumption or otherwise. So I like to celebrate my adaptability just when plans change or when things out of my control change. But I really feel you in your allyship as you support your students in their freedom and also speaking to their parents and just encouraging a softening that like, yeah, it might not be forever and like, that's okay. Let's soften there. And like, I feel your unconditional love for
Thank you.
the youth that you work with.
Yeah, they're amazing. And it's part of every school that I work at. I do a parent education night. I call it caregiver because we try to be more inclusive. But it's really, for me, I always have the best responses to the parents who are there. And it's always the caregivers who were not present who give me the most pushback. And I'm always like, were you at the talk, or did you look at my slides? Or, I mean, it's pretty wild. But yeah, I've had some really crazy parent interactions. The one that makes me the most sad was there was a mom who, she had 3 daughters in my class, and she said that she was really upset that I talked about pleasure. And I was like, that's something to take to therapy. But I said that sex should be a pleasurable experience, and that if you wait until marriage, that is a value. Because we talked about, like I said, we identify our values before we talk about anything. And most students chose to not value being a virgin until marriage. And I say virgin because there's no way for us to tell if someone is a virgin, scientifically speaking. And it's a construct socially. So. Yeah.
I was actually going to ask you about your ability to speak about pleasure with the different demographics that you're speaking to. And I just assume that the school system doesn't necessarily allow that. And I imagine that requires artistry and a strategy of how you present, just as you shared in your presentation.
Yeah.
So what is your availability to speak to pleasure with students or others that you're sharing this information with?
Yeah, I think post-pandemic, we've seen a lot of public masturbation just across the board in schools. And that's because students were able to masturbate like while on Zoom, like with camera off. And they just think, oh, I can touch myself wherever, whenever. And then they come back to the school environment and it's like, no, you can't just go to town on yourself on the rug. Is like a conversation that I've had to have more artistfully than that. But like explaining, I'm so glad you found something that feels good. Where can we do that? Not here. Like that's, yeah. And having to call parents too and be like, your kid was doing this and it was uncomfortable for everyone else. But like, we don't want to shame your child because a lot of people who masturbate and get shamed for it will go years without masturbation in their life, which can be very hard on a person, as we all can think of and probably understand just as humans. But yeah, I think a lot of the time I'm able to use like a real life example in the classroom to be like, we have students who are pleasuring themselves, which is great. We just have to have the privacy conversation a lot of the time of like, that goes on behind a closed door. But yeah, and it's even crazy too. Like people think, oh, that's probably just a young child thing. I had a 10th grade boy masturbate on the bus ride home from school because he just did not know that he couldn't masturbate on the bus. And again, that's a 16-year-old boy who was doing that. So I think post-pandemic, we're all learning how to human again, and that can involve pleasure as well.
Yeah. So exactly as you said, you're embodying and living what you teach with those in-person communication skills. And I wonder if you involve supporting students and understanding how to become aware of their judgments or projections of shame, and if you invite any like conversation around having more empathic conversations about sexuality and exploration.
That's a great question. I think teaching empathy is one of the hardest things in the world. Because some students, I feel like, will never have a sense of empathy. And a lot of times, that's why I love a parent-teacher conference. I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Because it really, the apple never falls too far. But just kind of explaining, I think a lot of the work I do in allyship is like, these are people. We're just going to be at least respectful. I'm like, you don't have to be their friends, but we have to have that underlying respect for their humanity, I think is something that I really fall back on of, even if you can't be an empathetic, kind person all of the time, we have to respect people's humanhood. Yeah.
Totally. And I was asking you about speaking to pleasure in the communities you serve. And I know you also do like a comprehensive substance education piece too.
Yeah.
And so are you able to speak to students about recreational usage of substances? And are you able to talk about those things being beneficial?
Absolutely. Yeah, I talk about recreational drugs or I call them medicines, really. I try to reframe that as much as I can. But I think a huge part of when I talk about medicine with students is I talk about consent. And I talk about, okay, if you get this medication, like how can you make sure that you're doing it in a way that you feel good about and that you're not going to regret years from now. But I never tell students no. Because if the DARE program taught us anything, it doesn't work. If students know that they have choice, they're way more willing to kind of go, oh, like I have a say of if I can do this or not. And it's crazy to me to see like everything changes when you tell them that they have options. But when it comes to any recreational medication, I try to be comprehensive in the amount of drugs that I teach them about and the amount of medicines that I teach them about. But I feel like in high school, they know way more, or they're willing to talk way more about it than in the lower grades. I think the youngest I've talked about medicine to youth was in 2nd grade. I had a student ask about like taking Advil or Tylenol. And I was like, okay, those are medicines. Like, why do we put those in our body? What do we want it to do versus what could it do? Like, what is a potential outcome? So yeah, the desired versus the potential outcome is the language that I use when I talk about any kind of medicine. But with recreational too, I love having the critical thinking question of why are there substances that we're allowed to use and there are substances that we're not allowed to use. So like having them think about like, okay, that might be not so helpful for all bodies or most bodies. But yeah, if I could go into the war on drugs with youth every day, I would. But I think eventually I would love to teach a college course where I get to really dive deep into all of these topics. But because I mainly work with youth, it's a lot of very like kind of high level and critical thinking. So just getting them to start questioning everything. As a Jew, I question everything. And I hope that students will never take everything at face value. Like I hope they're constantly asking questions and building our world into a better place for all of us.
I love that because I feel connecting people to their personal power is a really important skill that often school systems are designed to lead people away from. So it seems like you're inviting, yes, the critical thinking and then also connection for each individual to have a sense of their choice, which whether that's sexuality or substances is a really beneficial universal skill set.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. And I love your shirt.
Oh, thank you.
It says, "Oh, I don't drink, just drugs for me, thanks." So that leads me to believe that you're a medicine positive person.
Absolutely.
And have psychedelics or other plant medicines or substances been supportive for you on your journey of individuating and becoming?
Yeah, absolutely. I've done micro and macro doses of psilocybin and have really enjoyed them. It was actually because of my experience at Psychedelic Science in Denver that I became way more interested in it. But I feel like there's so many beautiful medicines out there and everyone is going to have a different experience on different medicines. And so I'm very quick to tell people, like, please don't judge things or say something sucks or make that like generalization for everyone. But of course, like, especially in LA, people are like, oh God, like this was the worst experience I've ever had. And I'm like, okay, we're not going to share that. Like, like that could work beautifully for someone else. So yeah, one of the, like workshop general rules that I make all my students adhere to is never make generalizations or assumptions about anyone or anything. And that's something that I try to bring into any kind of substance education for sure. Yeah.
Again, just another universal life skill to not make judgments or assumptions, or at least to just create enough space to see when we fall into that impulse of judging or assuming.
Yeah. It's a good reminder for, I think, everyone in the room. Like I always have a teacher at the schools that I go to be there. So like if a student says I said something outrageous, they can be like, no, she didn't. But I always go through the workshop agreements with the teachers and they're like, oh, these are pretty decent. But yeah, no judgments, no assumptions. And also I statements is a huge one. In elementary school, we had this like big felt I that we had to hold up when we would make I statements to our class. But it's still something that I preach to students is like, you can only speak from your own human experience because we are all going to experience the world differently.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Super important. Yeah. Well, I love to hear how fresh your psilocybin like experience was just after that conference. And I'm glad to hear that you have had impactful experiences with that medicine.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I also saw we love ketamine. So I wasn't sure if ketamine was a part of your journey too. That's
so funny. I actually had a horrible experience with ketamine, which is part of why I love this sign. I will never, I statement. But I have so many friends who have had beautiful experiences with ketamine therapy. So yeah, I loved that neon. That was the only picture I took at Psychedelic Science. But yeah, it's so beautiful to be in community and space with people who are understanding of psychedelic medicine, because I think it is like overwhelmingly a very open-minded, positive community of people. And I've loved getting to learn more so that I can bring the knowledge that I get into the classroom. Because I really do think that our youth are going to be way better off than we were at their age and into their early adulthood if they understand it better.
I totally agree. Well, thank you for sharing all that you have, and I would love to turn it to the audience to see if anyone has any questions or just reflections on what has been presented tonight. And if you are going to share, Paxton is going to bring you a mic so we can capture the audio for our online viewers.
Yes. One question about your work with, I guess, is a high school and college, and I guess I was curious about where the relationship between, say, brain development and the age at which, you can start saying, okay, this is okay, or this might be at risk just due to a brain development perspective. I don't know if that's a research topic of interest, but I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely need to incorporate more of the brain development piece into the education that I do, because you're right, there's like different theories, really. We don't have a lot of information about all medicines and kind of how they affect the developing brain, but we do know like amount of gray matter versus kind of when things are more fixed. But what's crazy to me is that there's so many changing ages. Like back in my day, it was like when you're 28, your brain is done developing. Now they're like when you're 35. So I feel like the age just keeps getting later and later. So in my very humble opinion, I just always tell the youth, these are the substances. If you do them, this could happen. This is maybe what you want to happen. This is what could happen. So really just giving them, here's the information, do with it as you will, is what kind of research-wise we know that kids are going to make better choices when they're kind of laid everything out and then can make that choice for themselves. But when it comes to brain development, I think there's just so much research that still needs to be done. And hopefully, I'm hoping that we get more solidified 34. Like, like that is the golden age. My mother always likes to say, wait till you're 50.
Yeah, wait till you're 50 and do all the drugs. That was what I told my children.
And yep, I didn't, but but yeah, I think in a perfect world, our students will be a little bit more advanced in age, shall we say, when they start experimenting with psychedelics. But I know that that's not the reality for most of our youth. So just telling them, giving them the information and then letting them make their choices, I think is just best. But great question.
When you made reference to erectile dysfunction in the kids, what came up for me was the relationship format that they don't have in their life because everything is here, which I wasn't really shocked when the kid on the bus was doing what he was doing because this is all he knows. So how do you cross that bridge with the kids in your relationship building with them?
Yeah, it's definitely, that's a great question. It's always fascinating to me and terrifying when students share that kind of experience or when I hear about it, because it's so different to what I think our experience was as youth. And I think having the smartphone has been the biggest and kind of scariest part of their adolescence. When it comes to relationship building, I think something that I really try to do quickly is get the students to know, like, I'm here to help you. Like, I want you to be happy, healthy, fulfilled adults. And part of the amazing work of being a sex educator is that, I like to say, I don't test or I don't give grades. The test is the rest of your life. Like, I really just want you to continue to be who you are as a youth. Because as kids, they know a lot about themselves. And I feel like as small people, we know so much more about ourselves than we do when we're older, because we try to repress a lot, or we just don't explore, and we don't feel like the joy that we felt at that young age. So the more that we tell them, like, who you are is beautiful and what you value is perfectly fine the way it is, the more they're going to be able to have less problems viewing that media or thinking that that's the normal thing, if that makes sense. It's it's hard to.
Do you ever introduce them to circle or that kind, like gathering in a circle where there's all diversity on the table, in order to use it as a foundation for, because we use that here in conscious conversations, and I just wanted to get your perspective, not having worked with a lot of children, but not particularly that group of kids. So.
Yeah, no, I think really building I call it a brave space, because we can't promise safety, but if we create a space where kids feel brave enough to share their experiences, I mean, that's the most golden thing you can have, really.
That's where the empathy can flow.
Absolutely. And in my experience, I mean, I've had students admit things around their peers. I would have rather died at that age than said some of the things that these kids are sharing. But it's part of the beauty of getting to talk about these conversations and pose questions. I will say I wait until probably month 2 to start asking like the super deep questions. We just got to make sure that they're feeling safe or feeling brave. But yeah, I think it's so important to have those circle conversations. I very intentionally have short PowerPoints with youth. Sometimes I will ask one question in a class. Like that is one slide of just one big question, and students have to critically think about it. Sometimes I'll do a turn and talk where you like turn to a friend, and then if you consent to sharing, raising a hand. But I think really giving the students the microphone is really important too, because they need to know that even though they're younger than we are, they have agency, their thoughts matter. And yeah, they're amazing people. I think they're just growing up in a time where they have access to way too much, but also, especially with pornography, there's addiction that a lot of students are experiencing that's very similar to like the vape pens. I'm trying to remember where this article was, but they said that the cell phones are the new vape. Like it's just so addicting. Kids are constantly on them and have access to so much. I miss the days of the flip phone because all you could do was text really badly, and 10 minutes later it was like, hi. But yeah, I feel for these youth, but I think they're going to be okay. I really do.
That was great. I have a couple final questions for you before we close out.
Totally.
And they're like rapid style-ish.
Okay. Love a rapid style.
So my first question is, who's been your greatest influence and why?
Ooh, God, that's such a good question. The first person who taught me how to create a K through 12 curriculum, her name is Deborah Rothman, and she has a great book called Talk to Me First, about being a parent who your kid talks to first. She is just an amazing educator. So getting to watch her kind of do her thing. I was literally, I think, 2 weeks into teaching sex ed, my first year teaching, and I got to watch her do that. That was really inspirational and cool. So yeah, Deborah Rothman, she's the best.
Shout out to
Shout
Deborah.
out to Debbie, yeah. Love
Great.
her.
My second question is 2-part. If you're stranded on an island, what book would you want with you to read?
Oh, that's unfair. You should see my bookshelves. They are full. Oh, God. A book that I'm obsessed with right now is called DIY, and it's Dr. Eric Sprankle, and it's a whole history of masturbation. And it's incredible. Highly recommend. I read it in 2 days this past summer. But it's a beautiful, really interesting history about kind of all the stigmatization to masturbation and understanding it more from a scientific standpoint. So DIY, go Dr. Sprankle. Right? He's amazing.
And on this island, you can also have one album of music.
Oh. Well, Well, my favorite album of all time is called An Awesome Wave by Alt J. And it came out in 2012 when I was, 10th grade. Yeah, good Lord. But I listen to that album front to back every year because it's so good. Yeah.
Around the room and age everybody.
Yeah.
And I also am curious if there's any psychedelics or substances that you're curious to try but haven't yet.
I would love to feel like I'm in the space to do ayahuasca one day. I am so not ready at 28, but I'm hoping by I'm going to give myself, I'll do what my mom says, 50. I think by 50, an ayahuasca would be great. An ayahuasca experience would be great.
And if you could explore psychedelics of any kind with anyone, who would it be and what substance?
Ooh, these are such good questions. Oh, dead or alive. Ooh, I think, Dr. Ruth is one of my biggest inspirations as a sex educator, and she recently passed. I feel like it'd be fun to bring her back and
Do ecstasy with her.
thanks mom. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like doing them all with Dr. That would be a great Netflix special. Just Dr. Ruth on every drug.
With Dr. Allie.
Yes, Dr. Allie and Dr. Ruth together. That would be lit, yes.
Well, I love that, and I hope that for you.
Thank you. We're going to manifest Dr. Ruth, yes.
Super appreciate you bringing your energy and wisdom to the district house tonight, and it's been a joy to receive your presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you all. Appreciate it. Yeah.